and nor is there a need to try every case. I'm not suggesting that everybody who pleads guilty is not guilty. Most people who plead guilty are, but there are reasons why people plead guilty to crimes that they didn't commit. And an example is when we look at the sentence guidelines. We spent a great deal of time talking about the sentence guidelines in this course, and if you remember, the guidelines are based on a chart. You look at the prior record score, you know, what that defendant's criminal history is. You look at the offense gravity score, how serious that case is, and where the two meet on the chart, that's what the range of sentences are. Okay, so let's think about an individual who has a prior history of crime. So he has a prior record score, a significant prior record score, and now he's charged with a serious crime, which has a high offense gravity score. And when you look where those two meet, he's looking at a potential sentence, let's say, of 10 to 20 years. And let's say he didn't commit the crime. And the district attorney comes along and says, you know what, in light of some of the weaknesses in this case, we'll give you a plea bargain of 1 to 2 years. Now that defendant, even though he didn't commit the crime, he has to think, wow, I could go to trial and get convicted. I could be in jail for 20 years. If I take this plea, I know I'll be out at the lightest in 2 years. So certainly, that defendant is going to accept that plea, even though they're not guilty. And we've seen a number of cases where individuals have pled guilty and have later been exonerated of the crime that they were accused of. So when we talk about plea bargaining, we have to look at it from both perspectives. Certainly, it's an important instrument in the criminal justice system, but it's also one that has made convictions much more easier for prosecutors and is probably being used much too pervasively throughout the process. So once we've gone through either a trial or a plea bargain and someone goes off to jail, we have to talk about the next process that we discussed in class, and that is parole. Okay? We talked about the parole guidelines. So in Pennsylvania, we use what is called indeterminate sentencing, which means you receive, if you recall during the course, if you receive a minimum sentence and a maximum sentence. Your maximum sentence has to be at least half of what the minimum sentence is, or at least double of what the minimum sentence is. So for instance, if you're sentenced to 2 years at a minimum, that maximum has to be at least 4. It has to be at least double the minimum. Okay, so you can't have a sentence that says you're going to prison for 2 to 3 years. Now you could have a sentence that says you're going to prison for 2 to 10 years. That maximum can be longer than just double the minimum, but there has to be at least double the minimum in terms of the maximum. That period between the minimum and the maximum is when you can be paroled. You can serve the remainder of your sentence on the street. Okay, so if your sentence is 2 to 4 years, you do 2 years. After 2 years, you're entitled to a parole interview, and you may ultimately be paroled. Parole in Pennsylvania is a privilege. Okay, it's not a right. So when you're sentenced, the courts look at your sentence as the maximum sentence. So if you get 2 to 4 years, the court's considering you are going to prison for 4 years. If you have done things right during your minimum, you might get the privilege of serving the rest of your sentence on the street. And we talked about how that decision is made. That decision is made by the parole board, and there are parole guidelines. And those guidelines, which you had a chance to review during the course, provide some important factors that need to be considered for purposes of parole. So if you've done your minimum and you've had good behavior, you've completed programming, and you have the DOC's recommendation, it's likely, according to the parole guidelines, that you'll be paroled and you'll be able to spend the rest of your prison term on the street, the rest of your maximum sentence. Now, some people get paroled and they violate their parole. They violate conditions of their parole, they end up back in jail, or they commit another crime and they end up back in jail. And they serve the remainder of their sentence plus any new sentence. So, parole is an important aspect of rehabilitation, because what parole does, instead of have you serve your whole sentence and then when your sentence is done you walk out the door with no treatment, with no programming, with no plan for the future, with no reentry plan, certainly you're going to have a difficult time. But if you've completed programming and you leave prison with an opportunity to be supervised on the street and to get continuing treatment, it makes for a better transition, it makes for safer communities, and it makes for, it creates the ability for people to succeed after they're released from prison. So, we talked about, as we went through this, some of the Supreme Court decisions that are important, prison crowding, we talked about trials and juries and plea bargaining and parole. The last thing that I want to mention is cyber law. Much of what you deal with in your professional careers in the criminal justice system is going to have to do with cyber law and the internet and other means of technology as things continue to evolve. And what we discussed right now in terms of the frontiers on the internet or in the cyber world is copyright, the infringement of copyright, the use of other people's proprietary information. We also talked about fraud and how the Crimes Code needs to be adjusted to deal with fraud as it occurs now in the cyber world. Defamation, social media and how it's affecting the way people interact with one another and how people talk and spread information about others, and obviously privacy, which is kind of coupled with that issue of defamation and terrorism. Those, unfortunately, are the things that you're going to be dealing with as practitioners in the criminal justice system. So that's our review of the course. The final has been attached as well, so you'll be able to take the final. It'll be due on December 14th. It must be emailed to me by December 14th, no later than 12 midnight on December 14th. So I enjoyed the class. I enjoyed all of you, and good luck in your futures. Hope to see you maybe in another class, and have a happy holiday.